This is Bluebook Digital SAT number 10, Reading and Writing Module 2. Critics have asserted that fine art and fashion rarely blank in a world where artists create timeless works for exhibition and designers periodically produce new styles for the public to buy. LSB beadwork artist and designer J.O. challenges this view. Her work can be seen in the Metropolitan Museum of Art and purchased through her online boutique. So, they rarely, I would say actually rarely go together in a world where artists create timeless works, which contrasts with designers periodically, as in constantly or every few weeks or months, produce new styles for the public to buy. But the fact that these rarely go together is confirmed by the fact that this person challenges this view. She challenges the view because her work can be seen in the museum and purchased online. So a lot of people might accidentally say diverge. You mean they commonly diverge, as in they rarely intersect, but it's not prevail or succumb. Barring major archaeological discoveries, we are unlikely to ever blank account of ancient Egypt under the female pharaoh Hatshepsut, as much of the evidence of her reign was deliberately destroyed by her successors. We are unlikely to ever have an imaginative account, a superficial account, an exhaustive account, a questionable account. Well, you would say you're unlikely to have a complete, detailed account, which is an exhaustive account. The work of Kiowa painter T.C. Cannon derives its power in part from the tension among his blank influences. Classic European portraiture with its realistic treatment of faces, the American pop art movement with its vivid colors and flat style, the intertribal painting style that rejects the effect of depth typically achieved through shading and perspective. So here you have a complex list, but it's a list of different influences. So the word basically means different. Is it complementary, unknown, disparate, or interchangeable? Well, it's definitely not complementary. It's not that they go together. It's that they are very different from one another, which is disparate, as in lacking parity or quite varied. Proposals to raise the age at which retirees begin receiving government transfers of funds are generally discussed in terms of the effects on transfer recipients, but AS has argued that delaying such transfers could blank wealth creation among working adults by lengthening the period in which they are providing financial support to their non-working parents. So, think about this in the real world. If they raise the retirement age from 65 to 70, usually people consider what effect that would have on the old people retiring. But this is saying that it would have an effect on the younger people who are still working, because you would need to take care of your parents for longer until they started receiving money from the government. So it could actually harm or stop wealth creation. So is it stymie, compound, disparage, or outstrip? Well, it's hinder or slow down, which is stymie. Following text is adapted from A.B.'s 1689 novel, The Lucky Mistake. A and R are neighbors who have been secretly exchanging letters through Charlotte, A's sister. Okay? A gave this letter to Charlotte, who immediately ran into the balcony with it, where she still found R in a melancholy posture, leaning his head on his hand. She showed him the letter but was afraid to toss it to him, for fear it might fall to the ground. So he ran and fetched a long cane, which he cleft at one end, and held it while she put the letter into the cleft, and stayed not to hear what he said to it. But never was man so transported with joy as he was at reading of this letter. It gives him new wounds, for to the generous nothing obliges love so much as love. So a really old-fashioned reading passage. You don't have to understand this perfectly to answer the question, but it looks like somebody was sad, right, in a melancholy posture, as in somber, and he won't even take the letter out of her hand. He reaches for it with a cane, but then suddenly he's transported with joy. Okay? It describes the delivery of the letter and then portrays a character's happiness at reading that letter. That actually sounds good. It establishes that a character is desperate to receive a letter and then explains why another character has not yet written that letter. No. It presents a character's concerns about delivering a letter and then details the contents of that letter. Well, no, because it doesn't say the contents. It reveals the inspiration behind a character's letter and then emphasizes the excitement that another character feels upon receiving that letter. Well, maybe the second part, but reveals the inspiration behind a character's letter? No, because it never said how the letter was made, and it never said the inspiration behind it. So the correct answer is A. Lily had no real intimacy with nature, but she had a passion for the appropriate and could be keenly sensitive to a scene which was the fitting background of her own sensations. The landscape outspread below her seemed an enlargement of her present mood, and she found something of herself in its calmness, its breadth, its long free reaches. On the nearest slopes the sugar maples wavered like pyres of light. Lower down was a massing of gray orchards, and here and there the lingering green of an oak grove. Which best describes the function of the underlined sentence? So, what does just the underlined do? The landscape outspread below her seemed an enlargement of her present mood, and she found something of herself in its calmness, its breadth, its long free reaches. It creates a detailed image of the physical setting of the scene. No, that's the trick wrong answer. It establishes that a character is experiencing an internal conflict. No. It makes an assertion that the next sentence then expands on. Maybe. It illustrates an idea that is introduced in the previous sentence. Well, let's look at the one after it. On the nearest slopes, the sugar maples wavered like pyres of light. Lower down was a massing of gray orchards, and here... So this is describing the actual physical scene. But is this the assertion that is followed up on by the next sentence and expanded on? I don't think so, but let's look at the one that came before it. Might make more sense. She had a passion for the appropriate and could be keenly sensitive to a scene which was the fitting background of her own sensations. She's sensitive to a scene which was the fitting background of her own sensations, as in, when she looks at nature, she matches it with her own feelings. And then the landscape below her seemed an enlargement of her present mood. Yeah, and she matches her own emotions with it. So this is a better answer. Several studies found negligible electoral consequences for governments that impose fiscal austerity measures, yet some European governments recently suffered electorally due to their austerity programs. E.H. and colleagues attribute this incongruity to government's tendency, not followed in the recent European cases, to implement austerity programs strategically to avoid electoral costs, e.g. setting spending cuts to take effect only after the next election, which has obscured the inherent political risks of austerity measures in the election data scholars have examined. Wow, what a dense question. So I'm going to try to paraphrase. They found little consequence when governments cut spending, right? Cut public welfare programs. But some European governments recently have suffered due to their austerity programs. Then this person and colleagues found that mismatch was because, oh, I see, yeah. In certain recent European cases, they didn't do this. So what they normally do is they strategically time the austerity program to be right after the election. So they cut the spending on things that you need, public welfare, right after they get elected. But recently in Europe, they didn't do that, right? They must have cut it right away, which did have a negative consequence on their actual government. Okay, these are getting really tricky, but let's go one at a time. Which describes the function of the underlined sentence. It explains the discrepancy between what has been observed in study settings and what has been observed in real-world settings that the text goes on to assert is attributable to the studies not using real-world data. I don't think so, because these are all real world, right? Its studies have observed its electoral consequences for governments, and then in Europe it was different, but it's not non-real world, so I don't think so. It identifies a conflict between research findings and recent events that the text goes on to suggest is a consequence of a complicating factor in the data used to generate those findings. That actually sounds good. So they attribute this incongruity, as in they say the very specific reason that there's a conflict between it. And of course, the complicating factor is that in Europe, they did the austerity right away, whereas normally they do it after the actual election. I believe it's this, but let's look at all four. It presents a long-standing divergence in research findings that the text goes on to say is due to different groups of researchers using data that derive from different electoral circumstances. I don't think it's a long-standing divergence because it just says some European governments recently, so it's not long-standing. It describes a recent exception to a general pattern in research findings that the text goes on to explain as a result of researchers underestimating the significance of inconsistencies in the data they've analyzed. Not quite. It was good up until researchers underestimating the significance of inconsistencies. No, I think they've acknowledged and figured out the inconsistencies, and that's the whole point of it. So I believe it's B, but these are tough questions now. It's because we had done perfectly on the first module. 18th century economist Adam Smith is famed for his metaphor of the invisible hand, which he putatively used to illustrate a robust model of how individuals produce aggregate benefits by pursuing their own economic interest. Note putatively. As GK has shown, Smith deploys this metaphor only once in his economic writings to make a narrow point about the then dominant economic theory of mercantilism, and it was largely ignored until some 20th century economists eager to secure an intellectual pedigree for their views elevated it to a fully fledged paradigm. So notice that they harp on the note putatively, as in supposedly. I think the point they're trying to make here, I believe the point they're trying to make is that Smith himself didn't think it was such an enormous deal. Smith did not focus on using that phrase as all important. It was only much later that people latched on to using that phrase and it became a fully fledged paradigm, as in a model phrase that people bandy about as if it were something famous. Best states the main idea of the text. Although Smith is famed for his metaphor of the invisible hand, the metaphor was largely ignored until economists in the 20th century came to realize that the metaphor was a robust model that anticipated their own views. I don't think so. I think that's almost right, but not quite, but let's leave that. Some 20th century economists gave Smith's metaphor of the invisible hand a significance it does not have in Smith's work, but it is nevertheless a useful model of how individuals produce aggregate benefits by pursuing their own economic interests. No, the main point is that it actually wasn't famous in Smith's work itself. So it's not but nevertheless it's a useful model. That's not the main point. Smith's metaphor of the invisible hand has been interpreted as a model of how individuals acting in their own interests produce aggregate benefits, but it was intended as a subtle critique of the economic theory of mercantilism. No, it was not a subtle critique of mercantilism. It was agreeing with mercantilism, and that's also not the main point of this text. The reputation of Smith's metaphor of the invisible hand is not due to the importance of the metaphor in Smith's work, but rather to the promotion of the metaphor by some later economists for their own ends. I think D is a better answer because you can match very specifically the text. The promotion of the metaphor by some later economists for their own ends matches with eager to secure an intellectual pedigree for their views. So the much later economists latched onto it for their own ends, for their own purpose, their own benefit. To You is an 1856 poem by Walt Whitman. In the poem, Whitman suggests that he deeply understands the reader whom he addresses directly, writing, "Your true soul and body appear before me." That sounds good for deeply understanding the person you're talking to. "Whoever you are, now I place my hand upon you, that you be my poem." Well, no, because you wouldn't say whoever you are, because you would already be sure, because you deeply understand the reader, so no. "I should have made my way straight to you long ago." I don't think so. "Whoever you are," well, no, it can't be that, because whoever you are means that you don't understand who you're talking to. So this is just A. Average number, wow, tough grid of information. When hibernating, Alaska marmots and Arctic ground squirrels enter a state called torpor, which minimizes the energy their bodies need to function. Often, a hibernating animal will temporarily come out of torpor, called an arousal episode, and its metabolic rate will rise, burning more of the precious energy the animal needs to survive the winter. Alaska marmots hibernate in groups and therefore burn less energy keeping warm during these episodes than they would if they were alone. A researcher hypothesized that because Arctic ground squirrels hibernate alone, they would likely exhibit longer bouts of torpor and shorter arousal episodes than Alaska marmots. Which choice best describes data from the table that support the researcher's hypothesis? So, researcher hypothesized that. So here's the actual hypothesis. The Arctic ground squirrels would likely exhibit longer bouts of torpor. Longer bouts of torpor, that's this row of information. Is it true that the Arctic have longer? Yeah, 16 days instead of 13 days, okay? Is it true that the Arctic have shorter arousal? That's this row. Arctic have shorter arousal. Yeah, that's 14 instead of 21. So I would say that those two rows that are now highlighted pink are what prove the point. Let's go one at a time. The Alaska marmot's arousal episodes lasted for days, while the Arctic ground squirrel's arousal episodes lasted less than a day. Well, that can't be right because even 21 hours is still less than one full day, so no. The Alaska marmots and the Arctic ground squirrels both maintained torpor for several consecutive days per bout on average. Well, that's true, but not the answer, because it has to compare the right column and the left column for what's highlighted pink. The Alaska marmots had shorter torpor bouts and longer arousal episodes than the Arctic ground squirrels did. Well, it seems like that's the information here, but it's phrased the other way around. So let's look at this one more time. Arctic ground squirrels hibernate alone. They would likely exhibit longer torpor. So the Arctic have longer torpor. And then this says the Alaska have shorter torpor. Sure. Okay. Yeah. So it's phrased the other way around. And then this one says the original hypothesis was that the Arctic have shorter arousal, right? 14 shorter than 21. And then this says the Alaska have longer arousal. Yeah. So this is the right answer. It's just that it's phrased backwards. Just to be thorough, the Alaska marmots had more torpor bouts than arousal episodes, but the arousal... Well, no, because that doesn't compare the two species, so it's C. In the mountains of Brazil, BT and BM, two plants in the V family, established themselves on soilless, nutrient-poor patches of quartzite rock. Plant ecologists AA and PBC used microscopic analysis to determine that the roots of BT and BM, which grow directly into the quartzite, have clusters of fine hairs near the root tip. Further analysis indicated that these hairs secrete both malic and citric acids. The researchers hypothesized that the plants depend on dissolving underlying rock with these acids, as the process not only creates channels for continued growth, but also releases phosphates that provide the vital nutrient phosphorus. So the hypothesis is they depend on dissolving underlying rock with these acids. So they use these hairs to secrete these acids, but they depend on dissolving underlying rock. So the plants will always want to dissolve the rock using those acids. Okay? Which finding, if true, would most directly support their hypothesis? Other species in the V family are found in terrains with more soil but have root structures similar to those of BT and BM. I don't think so, because that doesn't mention what the acids do to the rock, but let's leave that. Though BT and BM both secrete citric and malic acids, each species produces the acids in different proportions. Well, no, that has nothing to do with whether they need that process to release phosphates as a vital nutrient. The roots of BT and BM carve new entry points into rocks even when cracks in the surface are readily available. They carve new entry points into rocks even when cracks in the surface are readily available. So the plants will want to break down the rock even if they could just grow into cracks that are already there. That actually sounds like it might be the answer, but let's look at the last one. BT and BM thrive even when transferred to the surfaces of rocks that do not contain phosphates. Well, that's might be true, but it's not the answer. You're trying to say that they definitely need the process of releasing the acids to break down the rock, because breaking down the rock gives them that special nutrient. So I think it's actually C. That's a really tough question, though. Employment by sector in France and the US, okay, as percent of total. Over the past 200 years, the percentage of the population employed in the agricultural sector has declined in both France and the United States. So that's this row. That's the row that starts with 64 going down. Of course, that's declined. And in the U.S., this has declined. Yep. While employment in the service sector, which includes jobs in retail, consulting, real estate, etc., has risen. However, this transition happened at very different rates in the two countries. This can be seen most clearly by comparing the employment by sector in both countries in. So the options are the block between two rows. So for example, 1900 to 1950 would be these two rows. Let me change to blue here. So did they change in a different manner in the two middle rows? Well, it looks like in France, agriculture went from 43 to 32, and in the US, it went from 41 to 14. So that's a much bigger change for the US. Manufacturing went up a little bit. Sure, went up a little bit. Services went up a little bit, and then in the US, it went up a lot. So this actually seems like a good answer. Yeah. 1800 to 2012. Well, that can't really be the answer, because if you go all the way from the beginning to all the way to the end, that doesn't show that they did it at very different rates within the process. So that doesn't make sense to me. 1900 to 2012. Again, it has to be a narrower gap, a narrower chronological margin, so no. 1800 to 1900, well, let's see. For the top two rows, 64 to 43, 68 to 41, that's similar. 22 to 29, 18 to 28, that's similar. 14 to 28, 13 to 31, that's also similar now, so it's got to be A. A team of biologists led by JHJ, ADB, and SH investigated the mechanism that allows AT plants to accelerate flowering at high temperatures. They replaced the protein ELF3 in the plants with a similar protein found in another species that, unlike AT, displays no acceleration in flowering with increased temperature. A comparison of unmodified AT plants with the altered plants showed no difference in flowering at 22 degrees Celsius, but at 27 degrees Celsius, the unmodified plants exhibited accelerated flowering while the altered ones did not, which suggests that. So the species by itself that has the ELF, the hotter it gets, the more it flowers. Whereas if you take away the ELF, then even if you get hotter, it doesn't flower more. Then, sure. So comparison, which suggests that, I would have said it suggests that the ELF is the thing that's making it do the acceleration. Now let's look at the answer choices. Temperature-sensitive accelerated flowering is unique to AT. Not quite. That's like saying it's the only flower in the world that does that, so no. AT increases ELF production as temperatures rise. Again, not quite. It's not that they make more ELF3, it's that having ELF3 lets them do the thing. ELF3 enables, yeah, that's the answer. Enables AT to respond to increased temperatures, yeah. Temperatures at least 22 are required, no. The domestic sweet potato descends from a wild plant native to South America. It also populates the Polynesian islands, where evidence confirms that native Hawaiians and other indigenous peoples were cultivating the plant centuries before seafaring first occurred over the thousands of miles of ocean separating them from South America. To explain how the sweet potato was first introduced in Polynesia, botanist PMR and colleagues analyzed the DNA of numerous varieties of plants, concluding that Polynesian varieties diverged from South American ones over 100,000 years ago. Given that Polynesia was peopled only in the last 3,000 years, the team concluded that. So if you have the plant in Polynesia on these Pacific islands, and people have only been there for 3,000 years, but the plant diverged in its evolutionary trajectory 100,000 years ago, then it must just be that the plant was there before the people. So it's not that people brought it from South America. It's that the plant got there on its own before people. The cultivation of the sweet potato in Polynesia likely predates its cultivation in South America. No, it's not that it was in Polynesia first. Polynesian peoples likely acquired the sweet potato from South American peoples. No. Human activity likely played no role in the introduction of the sweet potato in Polynesia. Yeah, that's the answer. Polynesian sweet potato varieties likely descended from a single South American variety that was domestic. No. In 1966, Emmett Ashford became the first African American to umpire a Major League Baseball game. His energetic gestures announcing when a player had struck out and his habit of barreling after a hit ball to see if it would land out of blank transformed the traditionally solemn umpire role into a dynamic one. I'm just going to try these one at a time. And his habit of barreling after a hit ball to see if it would land out of bounds helped transform. That sounds good to me. And his habit of barreling after a hit ball to see if it would land out of bounds, helping. No. Bounds that helped. No. Bounds to help. No. It's that his gestures and his habit helped. Yes. Stomata, tiny pore structures in a leaf that absorb gases needed for plant growth, open when guard cells surrounding each pore swell with water. In a pivotal 2007 article, Plant Cell Blank showed that lipid molecules called P-phosphates are responsible for signaling guard cells to open stomata. I'm going to read these one at a time. In a pivotal 2007 article, plant cell biologist Yuri Lee showed, no, that pausing is wrong in that scheme. In a pivotal 2007 article, plant cell biologist Yuri Lee showed that lipid molecules. I don't think the comma after Lee works. I think it might actually just be C with no pausing. In a pivotal 2007 article, plant cell biologist Yuri Lee showed that lipid molecules. I think that's the right answer, but let's look at all of them. In a pivotal 2007 article, plant cell biologist Yuri Lee showed that lipid molecules. Close, but no. So if you put a comma before and after a name like this, that implies that you could remove it completely and it wouldn't matter. So let's try removing it completely. In a pivotal 2007 article, plant cell biologists showed that lipid molecules. No, then it doesn't make sense. So that's why it's not that one. It's really tough for some students on the SAT to say that it's no punctuation at all, but that actually is the right answer. I'm going to say it one more time with no commas. In a pivotal 2007 article, plant cell biologist Yuri Lee showed that lipid molecules called P-phosphates are responsible for signaling guard cells to open stomata. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, automobiles were commonly referred to as horseless carriages after the older technology that they still resembled. Known as the brass era, this period in automotive design is remembered for its grandeur and artistry, its vehicles blank by collectors for their ornate detailing and gleaming brass fittings. Its vehicles are highly prized. Okay, so A is the trick wrong answer. A actually would be okay if the word its started a new sentence, but it doesn't. So A would create a comma splice mistake because this comma would be splicing or joining together two full sentences. But you can't do that, right? You can't go full sentence, comma, other full sentence. That's also why it's not B as in boy, and also why it's not D as in dog. So the right answer is actually C, but this is a really advanced phrasing. I'm going to say it with the right answer. Known as the brass era, this period in automotive design is remembered for its grandeur and artistry, its vehicles highly prized by collectors for their ornate detailing and gleaming brass fittings. Yeah, that's a really tricky phrasing, but that is the right answer. During the English neoclassical period, many writers imitated the epic poetry and satires of ancient Greece and Rome. They were not the first in England to adopt the literary modes of classical blank. Some of the most prominent figures of the earlier Renaissance period were also influenced by ancient Greek and Roman literature. So the options between the answer choices have to do with the rules of punctuation, of course. Let me say it with A. They were not the first in England to adopt the literary modes of classical antiquity. However, some of the most important figures... No. They were not the first in England to adopt the literary modes of classical antiquity. However, some, well, no, because that would be a comma splice mistake. One or the other of these would be attempting to join together two full sentences, so no. So it definitely has to do with semicolons, but the difference between C and D you have to ponder carefully, including the intonation when you read it aloud. I'm going to read it with C as in cat. They were not the first in England to adopt the literary modes of classical antiquity, however. Some of the most prominent figures of the early Renaissance period were also influenced by ancient Greek and Roman literature. Yeah, that's the right answer. So the semicolon means that the two full sentences go together. So the neoclassicists were not the first ones to do it. However, some earlier figures had also done it. The trick is explaining why it's not D as in dog. I'm going to say it with D as in dog. They were not the first in England to adopt the literary modes of classical antiquity. However, some of the most prominent figures of the early Renaissance period were also influenced by ancient Greek and Roman literature. That's actually grammatically valid, but it doesn't make sense anymore because D as in dog would be implying that the fact that they weren't the first is opposite from other people had already done it. But it's actually no. The fact that they weren't the first, however, goes together with the fact that other people had already done it. Again, we're in the really tricky zone of the second half of the second module when you got all of them correct on the first module. With the development of new technologies that use natural resources more efficiently, the overall consumption of those resources might be expected to decrease. Economists have observed that improvements in efficiency often correlate negatively with resource blank. Efficiency gains, lowering the cost of use, may increase demand to the extent that resource consumption ultimately rises. So what ends up happening goes against what was perhaps expected. So you might expect that using natural resources more efficiently lowers consumption. But what actually happens is if you use resources more efficiently, they end up costing less to use, so you use more of them total. So it helps to sort of understand that abstractly, but now let's process the grammar. I think this is actually very similar to the one right before it. I'm going to say it with A. Economists have observed that improvements in efficiency often correlate negative with resource conservation, though efficiency gains, lowering the cost... Well, no, that would be a comma splice mistake because after the word though, it would have to be a period and a capital letter or maybe a semicolon, so no. So B as in boy is wrong for the flip reason because the thing on the right-hand side of the semicolon is not a full sentence. Let me just say what's on the right-hand side. Though efficiency gains, lowering the cost of use, may increase demand to the extent that resource consumption ultimately rises, that's not a sentence because you're still waiting to get to a main verb, so no. So it's probably C, but I'm going to read C. Economists have observed that improvements in efficiency often correlate negatively with resource conservation, though. Efficiency gains, lowering the cost of use, may increase demand to the extent that resource consumption ultimately rises. That's the answer. And then again, you can explain why it's not D as in dog, but let me say it with D as in dog. Economists have observed that improvements in efficiency often correlate negatively with resource conservation, though efficiency gains, lowering the cost of use, may increase demand to the extent... No, because that would imply that those go apart. C is the right answer. Tough. The ghazal, a poetic form originating in 7th century Arabic poetry, has an intricate structure. The 20th century K.A. poet A.S.A. explains that each of a ghazal's couplets, while adhering to the patterns of rhyme and refrain established in the poem's opening lines, blank thematically and logically autonomous, resulting in a poem with, quote, a stringently formal disunity. Each one of the thing's couplets, while adhering to the patterns of whatever, blank thematically and logically autonomous. Oh, it's each one is, right? Because each one is each single thing. Notice that everything from of through matla is one big prepositional phrase. You could skip over that and just say, he explains that each one is thematically and logically autonomous. So that's just a tough example of subject-verb agreement separated by a large prepositional phrase. In November 1934, A.S.G. was living in what must have seemed like the ideal city for a young artist, Paris. She was studying firsthand the color-saturated style of France's modernist masters and beginning to make a name for herself as a painter. Blank, S.G. longed to return to her childhood home of India. Only there, she believed, could her art truly flourish. Well, it seems like this all goes against the fact that she was living in the ideal city. So she was having a good life in one place, but she longed to return to India. So the word has to mean something like however. Is it still, therefore, indeed, or furthermore? Definitely not therefore. It's not indeed, because that would imply that it goes furthermore or with it. And it's not furthermore, of course, so it's still. Still as in however, or yet. Researchers H, L, and M report that while mathematicians may have traditionally worked alone, evidence points to a shift in the opposite direction. Blank, mathematicians are choosing to collaborate with their peers, a trend illustrated by a rise in the number of mathematics publications credited to multiple authors. Evidence points to a shift in the opposite direction. So evidence points to the fact that they're no longer working alone, as in now they are collaborating more often. That's the trend that's shown recently. Similarly, for this reason, furthermore, increasingly. Well, it's a recent trend illustrated. So it's more like recently, as in, increasingly makes the most sense. The prime meridian, the global indicator of 0 degrees longitude established in 1884, was originally determined using astronomically derived coordinates. Blank, as decades passed, new calculations would reveal increasingly precise coordinates, yet the prime meridian remained unchanged. It wasn't until the 1980s that, spurred by improved geodetic data, the prime meridian was officially moved, roughly 100 meters east. Is it specifically to that end, again and again, or granted? Well, as decades passed, new calculations would reveal increasingly precise coordinates. So this seems to indicate a step-by-step ongoing process over many decades. So, definitely not specifically. To that end, no. As in done for the purpose of something, no. And granted sort of implies that this would somehow go against it. So no, it's just again and again. Again and again, as decades passed, they kept updating it. They updated the calculation, yet the thing remained unchanged. And then finally they changed it. Yeah. Okay. Wants to explain how pineapple extract increased the growth rate of P. javanacus. Explain how the pineapple extract increased the growth rate. Researchers in India recently found that adding pineapple extract to fish food increased the growth rate. Well, no, that's the trick wrong answer, because it doesn't say how it actually did it. An enzyme in pineapple extract, bromelain, increased the growth rate of P. javanacus by enhancing the hydrolysis of ingested proteins, in turn affecting the fish's total food consumption. Sounds good, but let's leave that. According to the researchers, the growth rate of P. javanacus was affected not by food consumption, but by feed utilization efficiency. Well, it can't be that, because that doesn't mention the pineapple extract. The enzyme bromelain enhanced P. javanacus' absorption of ingested proteins, increasing the growth rate of fish-fed pineapple extract. So it seems like B and D both say that the pineapple functioned in some manner. Now we may have to actually look at the data over here, considering that we're at the end of the very hard section, having gotten all of the first module correct. That's why they're giving us ones that are really, really tricky. So I think in this particular case, you actually do have to look back at the data, and let's find maybe one that doesn't match up. Species of fish, sure. Recently found that adding pineapple increase, yeah. Adding the pineapple extract didn't. did not affect total food consumption. Okay. So that's why it's not B as in boy, because if you look at the end of B as in boy, it says affecting, and that directly contradicts what it says in the facts. So this is one of those unusual cases where you actually do have to look at the facts specifically. That's why it's not this one, so D is the right answer. Wants to explain an advantage of microprobes. Despite being heavy, NASA's rovers can land successfully on the surface of Mars. Well, the despite being heavy doesn't seem to flow to me, so let's leave that. Microprobes, which weigh as little as 50 milligrams, could explore areas of Mars that are inaccessible to NASA's heavy-wheeled rovers. That sounds good. NASA currently uses its rovers on Mars, but microprobes have been proposed as an alternative. Well, no, because that doesn't explain the advantage. Though they're different sizes, both microprobes and rovers can be used to... Well, no, again, that doesn't emphasize the advantage, so it's got to be B. Wants to emphasize the study's methodology. Emphasize the study's methodology, as in highlight how they did the study, how they set it up. The student policies of 132 medical schools can be found online according to... Well, no, that doesn't explain the methodology. To find out how many medical schools have guidelines about student social media use, TK and her team examined the student policies of 132 medical schools. That sounds good. Out of 132 medical schools, only 13 had student policies that mentioned social media, and only 5 specified what use was acceptable. Well, no, because that's not the methodology. That's not how they went about doing the experiment or the study. TK and her team wanted to know how many medical schools have student social media policies in place about... Well, no, that's the goal. That's the initial aim, but that's not the methodology. This explains how they did it. Wants to make a generalization about the kind of study conducted by GBNS. A generalization about the kind of study. Based on stats, GBNS claimed that John Lennon wrote the verse of In My Life. A generalization about the kind of study. I don't think that's a generalization. That's like the very specific conclusion. There's only an 18.9% probability that Paul McCartney wrote the verse for In My Life. John Lennon's... Again, that's not a generalization about a kind of study. It is likely that John Lennon, but not Paul McCartney, wrote... No, it's got to be the last one. I'm hoping the last one is categorically different. Researchers have used statistical methods to address questions of authorship within the field of music. Of course, right? Now, that's a really tricky, because this itself is not any of the bullet points on the left. So this question is all about reading the prompt carefully. A, B, and C might all be true, but they're not the answer. D as in dog is the only one that counts as a generalization about the kind of study they conducted.